is set forth here as the mode and relationship of the unchangeable has appeared as the experience through which the divided self-consciousness passes in its wretchedness. Now, this experience, it is true, is not its own one-sided movement, for it is itself the unchangeable consciousness, and this, consequently, is at the same time a particular individual consciousness too, and the movement is just as much a movement of the unchangeable consciousness, which makes it its appearance in the movement just as much as the other. For the movement runs through these moments. First, the unchangeable is opposed to individuality in general. Then, being itself an individual, it is opposed to another individual. And finally, it is one with it. But this reflection, so far as it is made by us, is here premature. For what has come before us so far is only unchangeableness as unchangeableness of consciousness, which for that reason is not genuine unchangeableness, but one still burdened with an antithesis. Not the unchangeable in and for itself. We do not know, therefore, how the latter will behave. Here, we know only that for consciousness, which is our object here, the determinations indicated above appear in the unchangeable. In section 211, Hegel appears to be engaging in a kind of summarization and repetition of what he did in 209 and 210, but he's introducing another wrinkle to this, or you might say reintroducing something that we're going to lose sight of very easily. And this is well worth thinking about in general terms, and hopefully we'll get to do that in a moment. I want to begin where he begins and where the paragraph actually ends. He's going to talk about the experience, the Erfahrung in German, that the unhappy consciousness, or that the consciousness has of being unhappy in its split and Zweite, literally sort of doubled away state. So what we've seen so far running throughout this motif of the unhappy consciousness is that there's two sides, right? And this is very typical, throughout the Hegelian dialectic. Consciousness itself is engaging in a play with its other, and it doesn't realize in this case that its other is already within itself, that it's not something totally alien. As a matter of fact, that's why the first stage is this sense that things are, totally foreign, totally other. What Rudolf Otto in his discussion, very beautiful phenomenological discussion of the experience of the holy, would call the numinous, or the totally other. Otto is onto something that Hegel has got as one stage in the development here. Now, where is this going to lead to if we take a look at, jump ahead a little bit before we get to this other stuff, where it's going to go? He says, the reflection, insofar as it is made by us, this reflection right here that we're looking at, is here premature. For what has come before us so far is only unchangeableness as unchangeableness of consciousness. That is, something within the play of consciousness where consciousness is conceptualizing for itself what the unchangeable would be and trying to grasp it, trying to understand what is of transcendent or absolute importance, that which remains the same, that which is eternal, that which is unlike the experience that we have of the everyday world, where things are not completely in a flux, but things don't really last, and meanings that we think are well established turn out to, when we look at them closely, not measure up as well as we'd like. So he goes on and he says, this unchangeableness of consciousness is not genuine unchangeableness. It's not the fullness of unchangeableness, but one still burdened with an antithesis, not the unchangeable in and for itself. That's what our goal is to try to grasp. And you could say that part of what's going to be happening throughout this entire section is a number of attempts to try to grasp the unchangeable, the eternal, the universal, in and of itself, and failing to do that, and that human beings need to go through, or at least, if they haven't read the Phenomenology and seen where that ends up, they need to try out this and experience the failures through the unhappy consciousness before they're ready to instead of just plowing ahead, more and more, to say, oh, wait a second, let's shift gears, let's shift position, and now look at this in a different way. And that's part of what's happening here in this development. So he says, we don't know how the latter, the unchangeable in and for itself, is going to behave. Here we only know that for consciousness, which is our object here, the determinations indicated above appear in the unchangeable. So, part of what he's saying is that this progression that we're going to now look at and chart out and explore throughout the rest of the section is only getting us partway there. It's not yielding us the unchangeable in and for itself. Where is that going to happen? Well, in its strictest sense, that's really only going to happen in the very last section of the Phenomenology in Absolute Knowing. But it's sort of like a will-o'-the-wisp that we keep on following out over and over again, thinking that one determinate shape of consciousness, one way of thinking in a particular epoch, one variety of relations within a social matrix, that these somehow become the absolute. And each time we find out, no, that's not actually the absolute. Hegel thinks that we do get to the absolute in the end, but it's something that keeps on drawing us forward. Now, let's talk about this whole business here then, right? Hegel is going to chart out this development, which now should be rather familiar to us because we've already seen it arising in the previous paragraphs. He says, the movement runs through these moments. These are the three moments, right? First, the unchangeable is opposed to individuality in general. So it's opposed not only to the individual as the individual who is the individual consciousness, right? But it's also opposed to individuality just as a category. By virtue of being individual, you are cut off from the unchangeable, and the two of them don't really mix together. But then, again, they do. So how does this actually work itself out? And like we said just before, one can sort of cycle around in this dynamic over and over and over again, just changing the object of what counts as the unchangeable. So what's the second? He says, then being an individual, it is opposed to another individual. So the unchangeable becomes an individual. The unchangeable takes on determinateness, enters into history, we could say, enters into the social matrix, acquires a language. We can go on and on and on thinking about how determinacy works in this case. But the main point is that it confronts the individual who now is moved on to a certain extent. It confronts it as another individual. We're going to see that this individual is a bit different than this individual, right? And then the third is, he says, finally it is one with it. And this, the unchangeable and the individual, we saw in previous paragraphs. This is where the realm of spirit lies. Spirit as involving a kind of recognition and reconciliation. The unchangeable and the individual are related to each other no longer in conflict, but rather are reconciled to each other. There is a Versöhnung, where the individual realizes he or she has a place within the unchangeable. Now, all of this, like Hegel is saying, involves the consciousness of the unchangeable and its consciousness as the unchangeable that we project outside of ourselves, even though it really is us. And that's why we can actually grasp it in the first place, because it is, to a certain extent, akin to us. This is the more true, more real state. But all too often we're stuck back here, not realizing that is what we're tending towards. And the individual consciousness, which is the one who actually does experiences unhappiness, Unglück, right? Why? Because it doesn't realize that it's in this doubled state because it itself is making that happen. It just thinks that this doubled state is the way it is. So it takes this as being I don't want to say natural, because we might be talking here about what theologians call the supernatural order, right? Something beyond nature. But it does take it as natural in that it takes it for granted as the way relations must be. Likewise, it takes it as granted the way relations must be here, the individual as opposed to the individual, and making it to spirit is an achievement, but it's not one that we can sort of just predict ahead of time and say, oh yeah, we just got to connect the dots and now we're in spirit, we got recognition. No, it takes a lot of bitter experience working its way through. Now, when we're talking about experience, we're not just talking about individual experience. We're also talking about this in what we could say world historical terms. So the development of various philosophical and cultural and especially religious attitudes through systems, actual existing systems that people live out, that is where that experience takes place, and there can be a progress, this is the way Hegel sees it, from one configuration to the other. So, for example, God as the lawgiver, as the universal standing over and against the individual, as unfigurable, as not able to be represented in any sort of graven image. That is one stage, and then God as incarnate is going to be a second stage. There's a development taking place there. So what do we have going on here? A reminder that although we are going to be moving somewhere, it's not such a simple thing as snapping our fingers and then skipping over the steps to get here. You have to show your work, so to speak, and you show your work through history. For this reason, therefore, the unchangeable consciousness also retains in its very form the basic character of dividedness and being for self in contrast to the individual consciousness. Consequently, for the latter, the fact that the unchangeable receives the form of individuality is only a contingent happening, just as it also merely finds opposed to it, so that the relation seems to result from its own nature. That finally it does find itself in the unchangeable appears to it to be brought about partly, no doubt, by itself, or to take place because it is itself an individual. But this unity, both as regards its origin and the fact that it is, appears partly due to the unchangeable, and the antithesis persists within this unity itself. In fact, through the unchangeble's assuming a definite form, the moment of the beyond not only persists, but really is more firmly established. For if the beyond seems to have been brought closer to the individual consciousness through the form of an actuality that is individual, it henceforth, on the other hand, confronts him as an opaque, sensuous unit with all the obstinacy of what is actual. The hope of becoming one with it must remain a hope, that is, without fulfillment and present fruition. For between the hope and its fulfillment here stands precisely the absolute contingency or inflexible indifference which lies in the very assumption of definite form, which was the ground of hope. By the nature of this immediately present unit, through the actual existence in which it has clothed itself, it necessarily follows that in the world of time it has vanished, and that in space it had a remote existence and remains utterly remote. In the course of paragraph 212, Hegel is going to help us understand why the unhappy consciousness is actually unhappy. We saw that it goes through this experience, that it can't jump right ahead to the joy of spirit and recognition and all the things that it's been aiming after. Instead, it has to pass through a number of attempts to try to make things come together, and finds that it's never really able to get there. So he says, for this reason, the unchangeable consciousness retains in its very form the basic character of dividedness and being for self. Remember, being for self, for Hegel, when it's by itself, means a lack of something, right? To be for self is not entirely to be in and for self. So he says, in contrast to the individual consciousness. So it looks like the initiative is now passed over to the side of the eternal, the unchangeable. So he says, for the latter, the fact that the unchangeable receives the form of individuality is only a contingent happening, just as it also merely finds itself opposed to it, so that the relation seems to result from its own nature. What are we talking about there? So Hegel is saying the individual consciousness, that which is doing the thinking and striving and trying to sort things out, but which is contingent, also experiences its own relation to whatever it is, the transcendent, the divine, the unchangeable, the eternal, as shot through with contingency. It just so happens that the universal, the non-contingent, connects itself up in a certain way with this guy here, right? And it could be, didn't have to do that, it could be doing it with somebody else, maybe, it could have happened at a different time, in a different place, why here, why me? These are the sort of questions that come out of contingency like that. So, what is going to be the upshot of this? How is this going to play itself out? There is going to be a lack of resolution, we can say, involved in this. So he says, when it does find itself in the unchangeable, that appears to it to be brought about partly no doubt by itself, or to take place because it is itself an individual, but this unity, both as regards its origin and the fact that it is, appears partly due to the unchangeable. So even when there is this achievement of what appears to be a reconciliation, finding oneself within the greater unity or community or economy, or however we're going to conceive of it, as a bunch of individuals within this spiritual unity that is the eternal, there's still a sense in which, well, that's not my own doing. It's partly my own doing, and it's partly who I am, but it's really the initiative of whatever is coming down from on high and presenting itself to me. So there's two plays of contingency involved in this. There's the contingency of the individual himself or herself who understands their life, their work, their labor, their desire as contingent, as could be otherwise, as perhaps meaningless, as perhaps perched over nothingness. And then there's also now there's recognized something greater above, right? And if that thing wants to relate itself to me, that's contingent as well. And you could say, well, whose fault is that? Well, it's your own fault because you're contingent. So, of course, why would, there be any non-contingency in that? And they say, wait a second, that seems to be a being in which necessity, should be residing, right? So there must be some sort of necessary connection to me. But can you have a necessary connection to a contingent? This is sort of the background metaphysics of what's going on here. Hegel doesn't use the term necessity here, Notwendigkeit, but he very well could. Now, what I've got on the board is not what I've just been talking about. I've got what happens afterwards. So he says, in fact, through the unchangeables assuming a definite form, the moment of the beyond, the Jenseits, that which is over there, beyond what it is that we currently have, right? The moment of the beyond not only persists, but it is really more firmly established. So why is he talking about the moment of the beyond? Well, here's the backstory, right? So you've got the unchangeable that is opposed to the contingent individual, and the unchangeable presents itself not only, say, as an imperative from above, or as an alien being that, is totally holy in comparison to us profane slobs, or that which is of infinite value as opposed to the merely relative value that we in our lives possess. But it's also present as this beyond, that which is further than we can make sense of. There's a kind of resistance or a kind of void that we don't even really know what's there. It's beyond, right? There's a limit, and we're not even sure where the limit lies. We just know we're not getting the full picture. So, think to yourself, for example, of ancient religions and commands coming down from on high, and people saying, okay, so God wants this or that of me. Don't really understand why, but I suppose God must be, pretty bright compared to me. I'm kind of stupid. And I guess I'll do what he says and see what happens. There's always there's always a surplus there that doesn't get explored. The answer to the why ends up spinning out all sorts of commentary, but the commentary ends up being really just mere speculation. The best that human beings can do. And that itself can lead to dialectical advances. But the basic dynamic is still there, that there's a beyond, and it almost tantalizes us, or terrifies us, or dismays us, or we can have all sorts of affective reactions to it. Does that go away when the universal, when the unchangeable becomes an individual? Hegel says no. In a certain sense, it seems like it would, right? And that is where hope is going to be brought on the scene. An individual comes in and says, I am this unchangeable, or I speak for the unchangeable. And now we can relate to it in a more tangible way, a way that lets us wrap our head around these sorts of things and say, aha, okay, I can do things now in relation to something that I can see, that I can grasp. And that's the hope that's involved, right? But is that going to be realizable? Not entirely. The beyond ends up existing in the individual even more than in some sort of, thing out there that we're just dimly, dumbly comprehending and trying to worship or trying to connect ourselves up with. When it's an individual, think about our own relations with ourselves and other individuals. How well do we indeed know other people? Have we ever been surprised by them? And you can say, yeah, I just didn't have enough information. If I was really, really paying attention, I could really understand another person. And Hegel would say, there is a depth. There is something that it remains inaccessible within a human being, sometimes even to that very human being. Augustine is a great example of somebody who says, I don't really know myself all the way. I know myself pretty well now. I'm not really happy with a lot of what I know, because it turns out that I'm not really a good guy, but I'm better off knowing these depths of myself and these corruptions and things like that than not knowing myself at all, because maybe now I can cast some light on it with God's help, fix it up, et cetera, et cetera. We can pick all sorts of other people as well. If we don't really know ourselves in our entirety, how are we going to know another individual in their entirety? And if that individual is the universal, how are we going to fully exhaust that? How are we going to penetrate into the very soul, the psyche, the personality, whatever it is that the divine, the transcendent is taking shape in? So Hegel talks about this in some really interesting terms. He says that when this is happening, the beyond seems to have been brought closer to the individual consciousness through the form of an actuality that is individual. It henceforth, on the other hand, confronts him as an opaque, sensuous unity, as an other. When we see another person and we look at their face, usually we can have a pretty good idea of what their expressions mean. Sometimes we don't have a clue, right? And the same thing can be said about any other thing that we can sense, gestures, right? What gesture am I giving you here? It looks like I'm saying, come closer, but maybe I'm actually suggesting that I'd like to smack you in the back of the head. Or I'm saying, you should pet the horse, or who knows, right? I mean, there's all this contingency involved in that. And when we think about how we show, how we appear to others, that contingency cannot be eliminated. same thing can be said about these videos. You see me walking back and forth here in front of a chalkboard. I'm making fairly conventional gestures. I'm somebody who gesticulates a lot. I have a fairly animate face. My voice is not a monotone. It rises up and down, and I get excited about things. But do you really know what's going on with me engaging this text? You have some idea, but I confront you as this opaque, sensuous unity. And if I could see you on the other side of this, like when I'm teaching in front of a classroom of students, let me tell you, you have a whole sea of opaque, sensuous unities out there. You see somebody kind of dully staring at you, they might be deep in thought about what you're saying. Or they might be thinking about, man, I wish lunch was here. Or they're about to fall asleep. You don't really know. And we want to know. We want to grasp the universal. That's part of what this whole business is about. He also talks about this in terms of the actual. He talks about the obstinacy, or the intractability is another way of translating it, the actual. Again, when we're dealing with human beings, what it means to be actual as opposed to merely virtual is that you become, to a certain extent, although you're understandable, not entirely predictable. If you were totally predictable, then I suppose you'd just be sort of a figment in somebody's imagination, right? Or, total slave, I suppose. So he says, the hope of becoming one with this now sensuous individual as the universal, what's happening over here. The contingent individual is going to attain some sort of unity with the unchangeable individual by finding itself within the unchangeable and presumably finding others within the unchangeable. Is this unity able to be brought off? Can we just, by thinking, oh, I guess I am part of the transcendent, does that make us feel like we are? Does that make us know that we are? Does that automatically produce in us a comportment of being through acting in that way? Or does there still remain a disjunction that Hegel is going to say is almost infinite? He goes on and he says that this hope of becoming one with it must remain a hope. The very nature of hope, so long as it lasts, is that it hasn't been attained. It's lacking what we're translating here as fulfillment, Erfahrung, a kind of enjoyment, a state where things have actually happened the way that the hope wants. And it's lacking presence, Gegenwart, being present, you could say. So he says, why? Between the hope and the fulfillment stands precisely the absolute contingency, or inflexible difference, which lies in the very assumption of definite form. So it's not only here, it's also here, in the assumption of definite form, which was the ground of hope. So there's a kind of a paradox here. Hope arises precisely because we move from this state to this state, and then we're like, all right, now I can wrap my head around the transcendent, because there it is. It's that guy, or it's this thing, or it's these words, or something like that. Something I can actually look at, or at least experience in some way, and then we start to hope for this unity of ourselves with it, and that hope doesn't get realized. And Hegel says this in pretty glum, somber terms at the end. He says, by the nature of this immediately present unit, through the actual existence in which it has clothed itself, right? So the transcendent is there. It necessarily follows that in the world of time it has vanished, and that in space it had a remote existence and remains utterly remote. What does he mean by that? What he means is that insofar as we're hoping, we're not attaining. And for the time being, we're stuck in this realm of hope and non-attainment. So whether the divine takes a human form and stands right in front of me so close that I can smell the garlic on its breath, and talks to me and looks me up, eyeballs me and stuff like that, it's there, but it also remains light years away from me. This is not a stage at which the unhappy consciousness becomes happy. So this tells you quite a bit about why the unhappy consciousness should in fact be so upset and unhappy and unrestful, attempting further and further to penetrate into this beyond.